thanks for coming along on another outing. Today we're right up the north end of Snowdonia. Now I'm going to start out this time by apologising in advance because it's a lovely day, but the wind is absolutely brutal and I'm really struggling to keep my equipment steady. And also you may well be struggling to hear me because I can't guarantee the sound will be even remotely usable. Anyway, I'm about 2/3 of the way up the northern slopes of Elidir Fach, which is the big pointy mountain that sits right up the top of the Dinorwig slate quarry. But at the moment I'm round the other side from that, up by the lakes that feed the power station at Dinorwig. This little lake behind me is called Elidir Fach, and there's a big lake up the top that I'm not planning to walk up to today called Elidir Fach, and it's water pumped up to these lakes which then whizzes down the tunnels underneath the mountain to power the turbines at Dinorwig power station. Now I haven't scouted round yet to see whether or not there's any photography to be had, but the light is fabulous. It's changing all the time, but it's not too harsh because it's that late autumn light. The sun isn't really very high in the sky. What I've also got are clouds scraping across the tops of the mountains, so I'm hopeful I can find at least one composition here before I head off to my next spot. Well, this is proving really tough. The wind is savage. I'm really struggling to keep the camera still, even though I've tried to get down into a little dip. The other difficulty that I'm having with this shot is that I've got some really deep shadows in the cliff in front of me, but then the sky is extremely bright because the sun is not far off, about 2 o'clock. So the clouds running across the top are diffusing that sunlight, and it's really bright by comparison to the top of the mountain. I also want to try and get some sunlight on this foreground as well because that particularly interests me. I'm shooting at f/18 because of the depth of field that I need. I'm also bracketing at 1.5 stops because I think I'm going to need that much in post to make anything of it. It's absolutely fabulous scenery. It's just really tough to photograph in these sort of conditions. Well, I really don't know what I've got on the card. When you're bracketing, obviously you can see the different exposures, but you've got no idea whether you've got the ammunition to work with in post to bring them together for a decent final result. I'm probably going to leave it here for now and walk on round to the top of Dinorwig quarry, see what we can find round that side. See what I mean? Well, I was really struggling back around the far side of Elidir Fach when I was by the lakes. It's still just as windy round this side. I'm now overlooking Nant Peris and Llanberis and Llyn Padarn. The views from here are absolutely spectacular. Unfortunately, I can't really talk you through my images because I'm just firing off exposures when the wind drops ever so slightly, allowing me to keep my camera steady enough. Well, I've just found a little spot that's out of the wind. I can't tell you what a relief that is. So it's time for a pit stop and a cup of coffee. The thing about being up in the mountains is you can walk about 20 meters and suddenly you're in the lee of some sticking out little shoulder of rock or something. There's a row of 4 or 5 abandoned cottages where I'm sat at the moment. And the wind is coming from the usually prevailing south-southwest. So it's not hard to understand why these cottages were built in this exact spot. I never cease to be amazed at the scale of the slate workings in Snowdonia. I mentioned in a previous vlog when I was down at Cwm about how every single valley has got the scars of slate workings, but none more so than perhaps Dinorwig at Llanberis and the Penrhyn quarries at Bethesda. The Dinorwig quarry employed 3,000 men at its peak, and they were quarrying right up till 1969. The scale of the workings here is absolutely colossal. I'm sat here at not far below 600 meters above sea level. And these workings go all the way down to the lakefront, which is probably only 50 meters, maybe 100 meters above sea level. And it just gives you an idea of what these guys went through. I've struggled walking up a nice flat tarmac lane, which, by the way, I highly recommend if you want to get up to a good vantage position. And a bit like me, you're an old git with a gammy leg, then strolling up the tarmac lane up to the top here is actually quite an easy option. Well, I say easy, you puff and pant a bit, but easier. But when you get up this high and you look down on the workings, and you experience the conditions on what is a pretty benign day when all's said and done for the time of year. Imagine what it must have been like when you're sitting on a wooden plank with chains holding you onto the face of the quarry, and your job is to hack pieces of rock off in the middle of January, in a howling gale, in the pouring rain. I mean, you know, these are guys that didn't have modern fabrics and wet weather gear. It really makes you think what a hard life it must have been. Well, I found this lovely little sheltered spot to shoot from now. And I've got this absolutely jaw-dropping vista looking right down over the slate galleries across to Snowdon summit. It's just starting to clear, but we've got this band of broken cloud sitting in front of it, catching the side light. It's late afternoon, the sun is way over towards the peak of Moilaleo, so the light is coming across at about 20-30 degrees, so it's nice and soft, but it's bouncing off all of the little crags in the slate galleries below me. And what I'm trying to do with this image is to include this little ledge in the foreground with rocks sticking up. So I've got this as my first plane of depth, right across the quarry workings to the far side with the old quarry buildings in them, and then across to Nant Peris and the ridge running up to Snowdon summit, which every now and then is catching some sunlight. So I'm doing my best to time my exposures when all the different planes are illuminated. Now, it's not as easy as you might think, mostly because while I'm taking these shots, I'm really struggling to balance the exposure, as I have been all afternoon. So I think what I'm going to do is spend my time here. It would be nice to wander about in amongst the old workings, but I think that's for another day when the light's different. With the light and the sky like this, I really need to be taking advantage of that, not worrying about little bits of close-up industrial heritage. So with this really difficult exposure, let me talk you through what I'm doing here. I'm set at f18 and I've switched back to aperture priority most of the time I'd use manual, but this is really complicated and I want the camera to do as much work as possible. So what I'm doing is I've got an exposure compensation of 1 1/3 stops dialed in as the only way I can control the sky. But if I bracket at that, it means that I'm still getting enough detail to be able to work with it later in post for the darker areas in the foreground. I don't really want to get involved in focus stacking this because it's a big enough job sorting out the exposure. So by shooting at f/18, using my hyperfocal table, it tells me that shooting at 18 millimeters, I've got a hyperfocal distance of 0.9 of a meter. And that means if I focus on this little rock right down in front of the camera here, I should get sharpness front to back. Now I know that the top of Snowdon is going to be what's described as acceptably sharp. It's not going to be completely in focus, but it'll do for me because it's in the distance, it's shrouded in cloud, and in terms of this particular image, it really doesn't matter. Of course, it would be really easy to just zoom across and take an image of the light and the clouds playing across Snowdon summit and the ridge running up to it. But if I did that, I'm leaving out the story of the thousands of men that worked and died here. And I really want to make the most of the fabulous light on these old workings and the old slate quarry buildings that remain on the ridge opposite. So as far as I'm concerned, they're integral to my composition. Without them, it could be an image taken from anywhere. With them, it's bloody complicated, but well worth it as far as I'm concerned. Well, I must admit, I did zoom in for the odd cheeky shot of the summit of Dinorwig. There's cloud ripping across from the summit of Congorion, across the top of Cloggy and up to Snowdon summit. The light's starting to go now. The Snowdon mountain weather forecast had it closing in round about late afternoon, so I think it's time to head back down. I've had a fabulous afternoon up here despite all the challenges, and hope you've enjoyed coming along with me. I just want to say thank you to all of you who encourage and support with your comments and feedback. I really appreciate it. So I'll say thank you ever so much for tuning in again. And if you haven't done it yet, why not subscribe now and join me next time. Cheers.